Thank you very much, all. Thank you again. This is the last session, the last panel. And I would like to welcome to the last panel everybody to the reimagining of the urban in the post-pandemic era workshop. I'm Rafael Martinez, a research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities at SUTD. On behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Harvey and Mr. Winston Yap, and the center, of course, I would like to thank you for joining us today. The panel closing this two-day workshop is Urban Reimagination, Filling the Void. In this third panel of the session discussing the ways we can imagine the post-pandemic city and especially what could be done to safeguard urban futures, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. First, we have Professor Widyawati Sumadio from the Department of Geography at the University of Indonesia, and of course, Marco Villanueva Sardillo, who is an independent consultant primarily affiliated with UNDP as Sustainable Cities Specialist. I'm thankful to our panelists for taking time off their schedule to accept our invitation. Next, as we have been doing for the last 5 panels, so my colleague Winston will explain the modus operandi for this last session. Winston? Winston?
Let me stop share first, yeah. So thank you, Rafael. And I think at this point, everybody should be clear of the modus operandi. So first 35 minutes roundtable active dialogue, followed by 25 minutes of Q&A. And we strongly encourage our online attendants to submit a question for our panelists, if they have any questions. And they can also raise their hands and they will be allowed to voice their questions directly. So another point is that these sessions will be uploaded. They are being recorded and they will be uploaded on our website. So the videos will be distributed, and for those who want to receive a copy, they can email us and we will provide it to them. Yeah. So without further ado, I will pass the time on to my colleague, Dr. Rafael, to begin the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winston. So as I have been doing before, I will just read like the general background of the questions that we will be discussing during this hour session. So let me start with this. COVID-19, as you know, has led to a dramatic loss of lives worldwide. Many have lost their livelihoods and many more are at risk of doing so. How should cities and their inhabitants grapple with new concepts of normality amidst with widespread economic and social disruption? What must or should be done to safeguard urban futures? So let me ask this first question to you, Professor Widy and Marco. What has happened in your city throughout the past year that changed your perception of normal, and how does it affect your imagination of your city's future? Let me repeat the question. What has happened in your city throughout the past year that changed your perception of normal, and how does it affect your imagination of your city's future? Can we start with you, Professor Widy?
Thank you, Rafael. Well, what changed? At first, we have to see that Indonesia is not Jakarta. Jakarta is not Indonesia. Indonesia is larger than Jakarta. So, in my opinion, it's better if we don't just see Jakarta as representative of other cities in Indonesia. Jakarta is Jakarta and other cities that's Indonesia. What this changes, in my opinion, is how people what give hope to the government that with this COVID, they hope people, especially in the rural area or the community, the poor people in the urban area, hope many things to the government, even the government. Because this is the one that have the money and the power to make their life better. Because of this COVID, they lost their jobs, they lost their opportunity to make money. Then they give hopes to what the government can give them. In the rural area, and the government has many kind of supporting system to help the people. That's what changed. That is what changed how people look up to the government. When before the COVID, then they see that they can do many things without the help of the government. They can rely on their community. They can rely on their system. But now everything changed and they have to rely on the government. And that's, I don't think that's a good things to happen, because the government, the power of the government has a limited power. Like for the bantuan langsung cash transfer, when at the first 3 months they get 600,000, then after that they only get 3,000, 100,000. That means that the government don't have enough money to do that. Even the government give many kind of support to help the people. So with this situation, in my opinion, the people still can. I mean, the people in the rural area and the urban area still can have their own power, because the government give support for the small enterprise, entrepreneurship, for like give them some money, but they don't know what to do with that money. They don't know how to manage this kind of money. Like from the previous session, Ellie said that they ask people to fill on the form. It means that they don't know what to do, while the government gives them that money. So I think we have to empower NGOs or local leader to be more active in the community, so that they can help the people. So we need something to change, basically, not just rely on the government, but to the local people, the local leader, and also to the system that the people already have. Like in the neighborhood, we have sub-district, and then the neighborhood community, they do the surveillance for the COVID, and with this strength, they can also empower the people. In my neighborhood in Bogor, Bogor is close to Jakarta, but it's still small city. In my neighborhood, we empower the people that lost jobs with small money, so they can change their, if in the morning they usually sell nasi with rice with several things, yeah. Then now they cannot do that. They cannot go around the neighborhood to sell their food. So we empower them with a small amount of money, so they can sell like crackers. With this kind of support, they can survive. So I think we should look down that we have local leaders that can empower people. That what will that I hope that will change. Thank
Right.
you.
Thank you very much, Professor Widya. Marco, what will be your opinion about this?
Thank you. And first of all, thank you again so much for this chance to participate in the conversation, especially in a conversation with brothers and sisters from the region. So good afternoon again, and terima kasih. And thank you for that very thought-provoking question. I've been listening in since yesterday. I think as a general theme, what I've observed the past year is that this pandemic has surfaced the scales and the geography of some of these issues, and the dynamic tensions that I've also observed the past year. One of them, for example, is this rural-urban divide, which has become more apparent in the case of the Philippines. I think one of our colleagues yesterday already spoke about how a program of government that simply tried to send people back to the countryside, in fact, served as an additional vector for spreading the disease. Or the other aspect of the tension between the national and the local. We've seen that how the local governments have been at the forefront of the fight against COVID, and the responses have been, for the most part, really varying in quality depending on the quality of the governance on the local level. And this comes at a very interesting time for the Philippines, because next year we have the first year of the implementation of a decision of our Philippine Supreme Court, where our local governments will finally get the chance to fund some of their mandates with an increase of about 27% of their share coming from the national government revenues. And at the same time, perhaps a third thing which resonates a bit with what Professor Widyawati has been mentioning. I have seen, and maybe I have my biases, but this politicization of the government's response when it comes to the pandemic. But at the same time, I do sense an opportunity for the citizens or the citizenry to come up with their own more political engagement. And I feel that, when the government becomes more politicized in its responses, then there's that chance for the public, for the people to actually be more political. Yesterday, you've heard some of, I think, our colleagues talk about the emergence of these community pantries, or perhaps that possibility for more people to begin to stand and look at local government as an opportunity to participate in the political space. These are just some initial observations, and I hope that it's also something that we can begin to unpack as we go further. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. Winston, would you like to go ahead with the second question?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, and I fully agree with what has been said. And also, indeed, over the past few days, we have seen some recurrent themes emerge, such as inequality, politicization, as you have mentioned. And so my next question focuses on those balancing aspects of what we have heard and seen. And so, what compromises or non-compromises do you foresee urban inhabitants must make to ensure their livelihoods in this new future that we are looking at? So maybe for this question, we can start with Marco first.
Thank you for that question, Winston. And I think perhaps that goes also to the third point that I mentioned. Coincidentally, just about 2 weeks ago, I had a meeting with a former colleague in government. She's a deputy minister with the Department of the Budget and Management. And we were talking precisely about the challenges for next year when the national government begins to implement that decision I was referring to, and the challenges of devolution and how these local governments will have to step up to the plate as far as policy execution, planning, budgeting is concerned. At the time, one thing that came out during our conversation when they were presenting to me the initial plans of government, they were looking at the delineation of the function between the national and the local. But within this space, and this goes precisely to your question, I think, there is an opportunity to renegotiate the dynamics of governance between these two spaces. And that's where citizen participation, when you talk about voice and participation, I think that's where it comes in. I'm hoping that by next year, when there is greater funding available to local governments, that they will create spaces for the public to actually participate. And and I don't know if it's a generational thing. I'm 41 now. Unfortunately, my generation and a few people from perhaps 10 years within that same space, we grew up thinking that the only role of a citizen is to stay in the private sector, you do your thing, you pay your taxes, and then you vote every 3 or so years. But what we're seeing is that part of the new normal is that, you know, citizens do have a stake. Citizens do have to participate and take on their duties and roles in the public space. So hopefully, at least that's part of the compromise that I'm seeing. I do hope that what we're seeing now are portents of possibilities where people begin to take a greater role in civic affairs and civic duty. So thank you. Thank you for that, Winston.
Thank you, Marco. Professor Widyawati.
In Indonesia, we have to look at for the big city and the small city. In the big city, the community is quite strong, so that and also they have this similar standard for what they need to do. So it's the gap is not too big, but in a big city, the gap is we could see the gap between the rich and the poor people, but not the idea. The idea is the same, that we want to work again, we want to have a fruitful livelihood, yeah. But the knowledge is different. When the government asks people to stay at home, for the poor people, it's how could I stay at home when my home is very small with 4 people in it? So where could we go? So they need urban spaces, public spaces to do their daily activities. Like they couldn't go anywhere. They couldn't go to work, but they have to go out from their home because it's too small. Their children is at home, their wives also at home, so they need public space. So they create public space on the road, in the middle of the road. So for the people in the urban area, for the poor people in the area, living with COVID means that they need more public space. So I think this is what we should compromise for this situation. Public space is still very important for those people, with also, of course, with the health protocol and everything. But we should give that chance for the people to create those things. And the government or the other people never think about that. So in Jakarta, we could see every morning or in the afternoon, people will sit in their front of their home just to get the air, because they don't have anything to do. So public space is very important in this situation, but with probably we have to make a public space in a neighborhood, in terms of the neighborhood neatness. While in the cities, smaller cities, then the situation is different. The market still going as usual. The activities is going as usual, because they said COVID is a big city's problem, not our problem. And that's true, because if nobody comes to their hometown, then everything is normal, everything is okay. But the government said you have to stay at home and everything. So it makes them confused. So in this situation, I think we should do things that is not make the people afraid of the situation, but make them aware of the situation. Like you have to clean your, you have to wash your hands. That's important. So facilitate that kind of things. You have to wear mask. Okay, so wear mask. Facilitate that. Don't ask them to buy mask because you're not. This is not our priority. So if you ask them to wear mask, you should provide that. My student is now in all over Indonesia. They're not in Depok anymore. They're all in their home town, and we have a research. They did research last semester. The topic is when people break the protocol, the health protocol. So they said that the protocol, the health protocol, they obey the health protocol if the police is there, if the government person is there. But if they're nobody, then they don't have to obey the protocol. I think this is what means that they don't understand, because the communication of the government to the people is not right. And even in the government office, the people that work in that office don't wear masks, because they said, we always meet, this is our friends, we meet every day, none of us get sick, so why do we have to wear masks? So they will wear masks if they go out from their office, because they are the model, they are the role model of this program, of the government program. So with this situation, I think we have to rethink what should we do with this condition, with this situation, because Jakarta is not representing the Indonesian. So we have to have several programs that implemented in Jakarta, in the big cities and smaller cities with different approaches. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Widyawati. Marco, I think it will be interesting to hear your opinion about what Professor Widyawati mentioned. It's actually quite interesting what Professor Widyawati mentioned from the point of view of the interpretation of power, and maybe you can contribute or I don't know, give an opinion about this from your perspective in the Philippines.
Would you care to elaborate? Are you referring to
exactly to what Professor Widyawati mentioned about this connection and these disconnections with the instructions from the point of view of power, and in this case the government? I really would like to hear your opinion, how you see that in the context of the Philippines.
Sure. Well, it's actually been very interesting when Professor Widyawati was describing the situation where, for example, certain government officials would, or people in government would behave a certain way and have certain preconceived notions, not completely mindful of the impact that they're signaling as far as their constituencies or the public are concerned. And unfortunately, I think one of the words that has been really used to describe the response of the government in the Philippines is theater. We've seen a lot of how there's a lot of confused messaging, and apart from the politicization of the situation, there is a lot of political theater that's happening and that's coloring this response. And you compound that with problems of misinformation that's propagated all over the internet. It is a very serious area of concern. There are moments when you begin to wonder, and by you, I mean I can't help but wonder the extent of negligence or incompetence that would be required to actually believe some of these things. And unfortunately, we see this kind of behavior even from political leaders or government officials. I cannot help but wonder, given the access that this government does have to expertise, and they are not short of access in terms of expertise or of wise counsel. And which is why I cannot help but wonder sometimes if really it is also tied to, as you know, for example, next year, the Philippines is going to an election year. A former high official of our National Commission on Elections said that typically it's in the last 2 quarters before an election where voter behavior is determined. And it's what tends to make or leave a deep impression in the voting public in the Philippines. And so if you look at how these efforts have been phased, some might say rather irrationally or completely illogically, you might, if you look at it from the lens of how, and this is a safe space anyway, how an administration, which some might consider to be a de facto dictatorship or perhaps even a junta of sorts, is trying to really grapple with trying to hold on to power. And you see how this response is then being timed carefully and stage managed in preparation to lay the basis for next year's elections. And just one last note, this isn't completely just conspiracy theory, because as some observers would know, for example, this president, when he was a mayor and the way that their campaign was run, it was in many ways premised on this brand called crisis. And nothing more could be a better gift for administration that came into power on the premise of crisis, what some would say manufactured, than to try to seek re-election of its mandate, not with this president, but through other people associated with it, through a real crisis, which is the current pandemic. So there, but thank you for that very challenging question, Rafael.
Thank you very much for your comments. Winston?
Yes, thank you so much for sharing as usual. And my next question is geared towards the future of cities. And I think especially in these morbid times that there's a lot of focus on what cities are doing badly nowadays, right? And when we look at the future, it's important to be realistic, but I think there's also some hope in that things would turn out for the better. So for this question, I would like to focus on the strengths of cities. So how has the emerging realities and COVID highlighted any strengths that you have noticed in your cities? And can you please share them with us? Thank you so much. And for this, perhaps we can start with Professor Widyawati first.
The strength, we have a community that empower one to each other. I think that's the strength, because now we take care of each other. Because of this COVID, we try to know our neighbors. We try to get engaged with the community. So because we couldn't rely on something that is far from us, we only can rely to our neighbors. So with this situation, then we know each other, we take care of each other. That's the strength. And it's not only as a social life, but also in the economic life. I mean, like what I just in my previous explanation, that if we see someone doesn't have any job, no income, so we try to help them. So, but I think we couldn't do this in the long term, because this is more individual and more personal. So we need something to make this more formal. I think with the support from the government, with the micro entrepreneur support system, I think what we have in the neighborhood could be more formalized. But the problem is most of the informal activities run by women, but these women has to take care of their children as well, or their family as well. So they need support from the something that are more advanced in digital and internet knowledge, so they can do their things better. So we still need something from outside of the neighborhood to make what the neighborhood has more stronger than what we have now. Thank you.
Thank you. Marco?
Thank you, Winston. I think, as we've mentioned several times in the past conversations, what the pandemic has also done is really to surface and expose certain issues. I think from the perspective of the pandemic, the cities has, well, we've also seen what these strengths of cities in terms of the ones that perform better in terms of their pandemic response and the ones that do not. And we know these factors. We know in terms of institutional quality, we know in terms of the quality of governance and the leadership. And then so these factors, as alluded to by Professor Widyawati, in terms of social cohesion. You've seen other cities in Manila where, notwithstanding the limitations of or scarce resources, communities are able to step up to the plate. But at the same time, I think to the other part of your question, which is looking then at its implications on the future of cities, I admit that the past year, I've had conversations with other colleagues moving into space, architects, urban planners, space syntax specialists. There is an aspect of it that's looking way forward, thinking maybe sometimes even in terms of pandemic architecture. I fall on the other side that looks at a bit of nostalgia, where you see some of the other, it's exposed, what the pandemic has exposed is the necessity of sound fundamentals. The public spaces that Professor has been talking about. I happen to live in a city where I'm 2 minutes away from a public park, and that has vastly improved the quality of my life. I live in a city where I'm able to access efficiently and effectively public services. I used to work in a heritage district, and that district, thanks to, I've since reconsidered my appreciation of the value of our colonial history. We have seen how these public spaces in Intramuros, for example, have made it really ripe as a site for responding to some of these challenges. And these aren't new challenges, if you really think about it that much, or in that sense. But the other aspect is moving forward, especially in the case of the Philippines. As I mentioned, there is that next year, there will be a greater drive for urbanization. There will be a greater drive for municipalities to graduate into becoming cities because of this incentive presented by the additional funds coming from government. What I'm curious to find out moving forward, and this is perhaps going to be an ongoing conversation, is a more nature-based and culture-driven response to it. We've seen, if you've been to the Philippines, but I don't know if you've been to the rural countryside, we've seen other aspects of Filipino architecture represented by our nipa huts, which is excellent in terms of ventilation. You see some of the other architecture in the Philippines in our public universities that are more responsive to the challenges of our time. And I'm very curious how moving forward we'll be able to unearth or perhaps rediscover some of these responses that we've had for the longest time anyway. And maybe at some point even begin to exchange lessons and learnings with our ASEAN brothers and sisters. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, Marco. I think, Winston, is a good time to remind to the audience that we are open to, we are almost getting to the point of the Q&A. So it would be good if you have any question to let us know or to ask directly. So before we go to that, to the next point, I would like, there are a couple of things that we would like, Winston and I were discussing a few, before this session. We would like to invite you, Marco and Professor Widya, to have like, I don't know, like a general comment about your findings on this. What have you learned in this during these conversations? Because we notice, Winston, and I mean, I know also people from the audience have been very generous attending, and it would be really great if you can join us in the conversation and to let us know what have you learned from what new perspectives, what new ideas you think are interesting to notice in these conversations. Perhaps Marco would like to start with this.
Well, it's not so much the thing about, okay, let me restart. As a philosophy major, and I'll never forget what our professor on epistemology taught us on modernity, written by Aldo Tassi, that wonders about looking at the old things in a new light. And I think in many ways, it's about what one thing I've appreciated from yesterday all the way through today is really just being able to understand and see that there are experiences that resonate with each other's. In many ways, there are so many issues that we share, so many problems and efforts that or experiences that we share with our brothers and sisters in the region, or from some of the speakers that we heard, the professor from Colombia yesterday. So the same challenges we're facing in ASEAN with our speaker earlier from Cambodia. And which brings me to that other thing, which is really just wonderful, which is bringing people together, coming up with a uniquely, perhaps a more humane and a human focus of driving forward some of these ideas. It's not so much about just expertise about what is new. Innovation is often premised on rediscovering what we can do better from the past. And I think that's one thing that I do appreciate from hearing from our colleagues in the past sessions, and hearing as well in some ways, and I was sharing this with Maria Carmen, with Ika yesterday, it feels great to be in the company of our colleagues, even as I was just listening yesterday or listening in, because there is that sense of relief knowing that we're not alone. And hopefully these kinds of conversations will really continue moving forward. Thank you, Rafael, for the question.
Thank you very much, Marco. Professor Widya?
I have the same perspective with Marco, that we learn from each other, and that's relief, because now we know that our neighbor have the same problems. One thing that I learned from speakers from the previous session is that what interesting me is that we should work in a very small, a small group, small neighborhood with special characteristic. So we don't have to have a big picture of what kind of cities we are going to have in the future, but what kind of neighborhood we are going to have in the future. This neighborhood is different from that neighborhood. So with varieties of neighborhoods, I think this will make a new norm for our life in the future. And with this kind of approach, I think we get back to the previous concept, compact city, small, within a 15 minutes walk. So I think that's what we should have. So we don't have to look big city, but smaller. That's what I learned from the discussion yesterday, because every neighborhood has different problems and tantangan, challenge.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Widya. Perhaps Harvey and Winston would like to, before we have, I don't think we have yet any question from the audience.
Yeah. If I may just add, and I speak without knowledge of what transpired yesterday. I'm so sorry I couldn't be here yesterday. Some emergency happened. But you know, it's really befitting that we, of course, end the whole workshop with thinking about the future, thinking about what we can do in the aftermath of this ongoing pandemic. The one thing that I keep hearing is what is the new normal, or when is life going to be normal again? To me, and I'm being very provocative here, I think there's a missed opportunity here to realize that, you know, actually our life has never been normal. You know, not in Philippines, not in Indonesia, certainly not in Singapore. So we shouldn't even be thinking about going back to normal, for sure, okay? And even thinking about a new normal, I would say it still retains remnants of the abnormality of our society pre-COVID. So in that sense, I wish we just stop having this fantasy or this illusion or delusion that our society was somewhat normal before COVID, and then we are going to fix it now. It's not. It's never been. It's never been normal, I would say, and it shows in various ways. We are abnormal in different ways, but we can see key themes emerge. You know, principally inequality, discrimination, a lack of safety net for the most marginalized. And here I speak in relative terms. Well, of course, the most marginalized in Singapore may not be that marginalized in other Southeast Asian cities, and vice versa. So there is that angle as well. But in general, I would argue that each of us, we live in very abnormal times from as long as I can remember. So I am thinking what kind of language we can move so that we can completely divorce, and that would be taking the opportunities of COVID to the extreme.
Thank you very much, Harvey. Any reaction from Marco, Professor Widia? Yeah.
If I may, thank you, Professor. Harvey, coincidentally, it used to annoy me at the start of the pandemic. Every time I heard the phrase new normal, it reached a point where I tried to look at the Google Trends for the new normal and when it actually came about. Because we know how the phrase has been applied to other issues, and I think it tends to do the current challenges of our time to dilute that by applying it to, you know, the challenge of the pandemic and the prospects for a new normal. Marco, the other Marco, Architect Marco, yesterday also spoke about this, that, you know, some of the challenges that we have, they've never been, you know, good things to go back to anyway. This inequality, these are problems that, and to go back to that, if that is the normal that we're looking at, that's, that being said, I think it's going back, and then maybe it's a function of getting older. And I keep going back to some of those fundamental things. Before we started, Professor and I had a good chat about language, and we even recalled, I shared with her that I know a little Bahasa Indonesia, and I shared with her this song, which is Di Sini Senang. You know, I'm happy here, I'm happy there. A few weeks ago, you may have seen that article from the New York Times talking about this word, that what we're currently experiencing allegedly is called languishing. And then I saw one of my philosophy professors from way back when, and she said, well, the response has always been to flourish. The response to that human condition, which is something that even the Greeks knew from way back when, is eudaimonia, to aspire to happiness. And that's, to me, that's a norm that everyone should be aspiring to anyway. That is a norm that I would love to share, and an aspiration that I would like to have at some point among our ASEAN peoples. And I keep saying this because earlier Professor Widyawati mentioned the word neighborhood. Just the other day, Professor, I was talking to a very good Indonesian friend of mine, and we were talking about an ASEAN response to the future challenges of our time. Talking to each other and understanding that it's more than just the bureaucracy of the secretariat or the organization. It's about the ASEAN peoples, because the pandemic that we have now is just one challenge. And at some point, we will have to face the bigger challenges that our region will be up against. And we need to start having those conversations very soon. And if we've talked about the community of ASEAN, maybe it's time that people like us start talking to each other and think about the ASEAN neighborhood. So thank you, Professor, for actually mentioning that again. Sorry, Professor, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harvey, for your intriguing ideas. If you ask me, is the previous era before the pandemic is normal? I don't want to go back to that era. I don't want to have a very polluted air. I don't want to have a very busy road traffic. I don't want to be rushing every morning just to be in the university because our class start early in the morning. So with working at home, good, it's more productive and it's, well, in some way it's better than before. But in education, in terms of education atmosphere, it's not good because we still have to encourage students to have more skills, more attitude, that we couldn't do it with online education system. So offline is still better in education. But I don't want to have that kind of hectic and polluting air. But that's what is normal now. This is the normal way. This is the normal way in, like Professor Marcos said, that if we feel happy, we know our neighborhood, we know our Asian countries people, then that's normal. Rather than we know about New York or London, but now we look to each other and learn from each other how we will go with our life. So that's normal now. So I agree with you, but because I don't want to go back to the old normal. New normal is okay. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Professor William and Marco. So one last comment, I think Professor William mentioned a little bit about that, and I would like to go and to ask Marco the same question. Professor William, Marco mentioned how she imagined a neighborhood, how she imagined, it was quite interesting because she was kind of making an abstraction of the city and saying the city, the way I imagine, at least in the future, is a small context. And she compared to the neighborhood. My question is, you, Marco, how would you see the future of your city? From, I mean, trying to find like a connections with what Professor William mentioned.
Absolutely. I think, and thank you for mentioning that and calling attention to it, Rafael. In fact, it was one of the things I noted from what the professor was talking about. And I don't know if it's a very Asian thing to consider, the notion of having a community, the notion of having a neighborhood, and to be attached to that scale. On two levels, even with the work that I'm doing now for UNDP, I'm currently helping the country office to refine a strategy for its consolidated offer for cities. After doing an exhaustive literature review of all the urbanization strategies and policies of UNDP, what I've seen is that in the translation of SDG 11 in terms of resilient cities, and then moving to the shortened version of that as expressed as resilient cities and communities, I feel that the country office actually does have potential to carve a niche within by looking at communities as its subject of focus for its interventions. And this is especially significant, I think, for the Philippines, where social cohesion is very important. It's a critical factor, as I've shared earlier. Social capital is a very important variable in terms of one's upward mobility. And it's a very uniquely Asian and well-situated, I think, and nuanced and contextualized area for us to actually intervene in. I think it's a kind of scale that and focus that is appropriate for the Philippine context. Because currently, as you may know, the way that we look at our cities and municipalities, these are territorial boundaries that are drawn as political jurisdictions. The wherewithal for the real complexion happens in some of the inner cities. The complexion of these neighborhoods are revealed when you look at the character of our rural countryside and these real barrios or communities. And so moving forward, I do look forward to seeing, and hopefully part of that conversation about the future of cities or the urban future for the Philippines is that people-focused appreciation for communities. So thank you for that, Rafael.
Thank you very much, Marco. You know that one of the last things we would like to, and this is a good opportunity to do this. We are working at the Liquid Center for Innovative Cities on surveys in cities like Manila, or we did that already in Jakarta. So one of the problems we as foreigners, we always face is the fact that we don't understand this basic unit of the neighborhood. So, and especially, for example, right now that we are preparing our survey in Manila, we wonder how should we approach this idea of the neighborhood? Because it's not self-explanatory. It's not to say is this a barangay, or it is just like in the case of Indonesia, any other small or bigger unit. It's also to understand how people see that and how people will imagine at the moment when we are interviewing them. So yeah, this is quite interesting to see how flexible this idea of space and also the way they live within this space could be. So thank you very much for your comments. I don't think Harvey or Winston, any last comment before we finish our, or someone in the audience would like to ask something? No? Okay. So probably when I think we still have just like 5 more minutes at least, and this is I promise this is going to be the last question. So one of the things I wanted to just to mention as a sort of summary of all the conversations that we have we have had in the last 2 days is that many things, and you mentioned that with this idea of I don't want to go back to the normal, is that many things that we see in cities are actually not new. There's in some cases forms of discrimination, in some other cases problems in the city, as you aptly mentioned. But other things I feel that might be reproduced in the future, regardless we want or not. So do you have any comment about that in your particular cities? What do you think are those things that we cannot avoid to reproduce or to live once again in the future? I mean, hopefully without a pandemic context. Maybe Professor Widyawati wants to make any last comment about this? What are those things?
Let me make it clear first. You mean that the same problem that we have to face?
No, not only that. It's like the kind of problems that we, even if we don't want to reproduce, we are going to eventually live once again, but in a different context. So basically that kind of things that we cannot avoid having or living once again in the future. In some cases, yeah.
Waste, solid waste.
Solid waste.
We have that kind of problem. And with this new way of life that we buy food through online, we have packaging, many kind of packaging. That is waste. But in my opinion, in certain area, those waste can be can have an economic value if we have a cooperation with different kind of neighborhood. I mean like this. In the wealthy neighborhood, they have many kind of waste because they bought many things. with this kind of waste, the poorer neighborhood can collect it and make it as a source of their livelihood, any kind of. No one think about that. Almost every day, you are not supposed to have a plastic bag, but every day we use many kind of bags. That's waste. And we still facing waste, solid waste. That's what the same problem that we face.
Thank you very much. And Marco, one last comment about this?
Well, perhaps 3 quick observations. I think ultimately moving forward, we're going to have to be very mindful about really addressing and the persisting inequality, ever widening and worsening inequality in the Philippines by recognizing that a lot of these are actually systemic issues. And that includes, we've already started to talk about education, even the way that we rear ourselves for civic engagement and participation, which is the second part of what I've been trying to share as a message as well with other colleagues and with younger people. We talk about a government of the people, for the people, by the people, and we complain every time when the government seems to be bereft of good people. It's because the good people refuse to have anything to do with government. But one thing we've seen currently is that there's no escaping it. For the time, given the precarity of the situation of our middle class in the Philippines, we've had to fall back on the government ultimately, and we need to start fixing a lot of these issues. And perhaps just by way of a minor PS, and I remember when I must have been in 3rd grade, and there was a documentary about planet Earth, and the song they would play, "He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother." And there was a line by the narrator, and he said, the human person is a very interesting figure because he's not just a figure on the landscape, but he is the landscape. And I worry sometimes that over the past decades, we've focused too much on building a lot of things without really looking at introspection and contemplation and contemplating our role within the greater cosmos. We've lost our touch with nature. A lot of the imbalances and excesses that we see are lessons that we've refused to learn. If only we would also recall our place in the universe with perhaps a little, and reevaluate that by having a bit more humility. So long story short, absolutely, I agree with Professor. This whole notion of waste, solid waste, there's only too much waste because we're not attuned enough to nature. And that's, I think, a very important part of the conversation that we should be having in light of the climate crisis and the demands on economic recovery, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you so much for the question. And thanks for this chance to chat.
Thank you very much, Marco. Thank you very much, Professor Widyawati. And on that note, a very philosophical ending. Marco, we thank you all for joining this panel, and a special thanks, of course, to the rest of the participants, and your ideas and your insights were really very enlightening for us. Thank you to my colleagues. And as Winston said at the beginning, we are going to post these webinars in the. They are going to be posted in the Lee Kuan Yew Center of Innovative Cities website, and we would like to invite you to check these webinars later. And so thank you very much. Thank you again for being part of this. It was a big effort for everybody here, but we really appreciate your support, and thank you again for this. And we look forward to having you in a future event. Thank you again.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafael.
Terima kasih.
Sama-sama. Sampai
Take care, everyone.
Sampai jumpa, Professor Widya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.